Number 4, we're going to do the properties of real numbers. Before we had the properties of addition, which were our first 4, and now we're adding to that list. So commutative property of addition said we changed the order. We said our example for that was if I did x plus y and switched it around and put y plus x. But anytime the order is changed, that's your commutative property. Then we had our associative property of addition that said the parentheses have to be moved. The order is the same. So we had something like x plus y plus z equals x plus y plus z. And one of them had parentheses around the first 2. On the other one, it was around the second 2. So on this one, the parentheses are around the x and the y. Here, they're around the y and the z. Everything's in the same order. The parentheses are moved. Then we had the additive identity property. We said, what number can we add to a value and not change what we get? What can we add to 3 and still get 3? Well, it's adding 0 to something. So they're going to say that if I take x plus 0, it equals x. If I add 0 to something, I get the same answer. Additive inverse. Inverse means opposite. So the opposite of adding is subtracting. We said that when we took an x, and then my board doesn't want to work. So I'm going to rewrite the commutative. X plus y equals y plus x. The associative, x plus y plus z equals x plus y plus z. Parentheses around the first 2, parentheses around the second 2. Then we did the additive identity. X plus 0 equals x. Now we'll do the additive inverse. Additive inverse says we're adding opposites. So if we take an x plus a negative x, going to equal 0. Anytime you add opposites, you get 0. Those were the properties we had the other day. Today, we added the distributive property. We said the distributive property was used to remove the parentheses. So if I have something like, I'm going to move it over here, x times y plus z, we end up taking the x times the y, so xy, plus the x times the z, xz. And we've gotten rid of the parentheses by using our distributive property. Now notice when you get to the next ones, commutative property of multiplication, associative property of multiplication, multiplicative identity, multiplicative inverse, and then the multiplication property of 0. We had the commutative property of addition. It said we changed the order. The commutative property of multiplication is the same kind of thing. I'm just switching the order of my multiplying. So x times y is going to equal y times x. You may or may not have the dots there for multiplying, but just to show you, I'm multiplying instead of adding. Associative property, same thing, I changed the parentheses. So my associative property said if I had x times y times z and x times y times z, one would have parentheses around the first 2, and the other would have the parentheses around the last 2. So you'll have to watch out when you pick, it's going to be in the drop down that you pick the right one. Don't just look and say, oh, it's the commutative property. You have to know, is it of addition or of multiplication? Multiplicative identity. We said with the identity property, what you start with is what you want to end with. What number do I multiply times 3 to still get 3? Well, with multiplication, we're going to multiply something times 1. So they're going to say x times 1 equals x. If I multiply by 1, it's not going to change its value. Multiplicative inverse, that's kind of the weird one. At least I think it looks weird. The inverse of multiplying is dividing, but when we divide with fractions, we end up multiplying by the reciprocal. So the multiplicative inverse says if I take a value times its reciprocal, it's always going to equal 1. So their example is going to look like this. X times the reciprocal of x, which is 1 over x, equals 1. A number times its reciprocal is always equal to 1. And then the last property, multiplication property of 0, just like it sounds. If I take something times 0, I'm always going to get 0. So x times 0 is equal to 0. So if you go on the resource pages and print out RV30, properties of real numbers, it's going to have the words in there along with the examples. So if you're having a hard time, make sure you print those out. Otherwise, what I do is I look to say, am I adding? If I'm adding, it's 1 through 4. Am I multiplying? If it's multiplying, 6 through 10. Or do I have both adding and multiplying? Because then it's probably the distributive property. Here I'm doing adding and subtracting. I'm adding opposites. N plus a negative n equals 0. Looks like this one. X plus negative x equals 0. That's my additive inverse. I'm just going to write a 4 in there. The next one, I'm multiplying, so I know it's 6 through 10. 4 times 5 times 6. 4 times 5 times 6. Here the parentheses are around the 4 and the 5. Here it's around the 5 and the 6. I've moved my parentheses. That's this property here, the associative property of multiplication. Number 7. Here, I look at this one and say, I got both multiplying and adding. Oh, the only property that had both was the distributive property. Does that look like the distributive property? Did I take the 2 times the a and then the 2 times the 9? 2 times a plus 2 times 9. Sure enough, there's my distributive property. The next one I'm multiplying, I hopefully recognize that I'm multiplying by 1. X times 1 equals x. There's my multiplicative identity property. Number 8. If you don't have all those written down yet, pause the video. I'm going to move down to the next problem. Number 5 then. Commutative property of addition, associative property of addition, additive identity, additive inverse. Those are my adding properties. The distributive property has both adding and multiplying, and then 6 through 10, my multiplying properties. So I look at this first one, I'm adding. A plus 4 equals 4 plus a. I've switched the order, commutative property of addition, which is our first property. Here, I have both adding and multiplying. Tells me it's probably the distributive property. I took 6 times the 7, d times the 7. I got rid of my parentheses. That's my distributive property number 5. Here, I'm adding opposites. I have a negative 3 and a positive 3. When I add opposites, I get an answer of 0. That's my additive inverse property. Inverse means opposite. Here, I have 1/5 times 5 equals 1. That's the one I said looked kind of weird. I'm taking something times its reciprocal, it's equal to 1. That's my multiplicative inverse property. Multiplying by the reciprocal. Multiplicative inverse, number 9. Go ahead, try to do the next 4 here while I'm moving the board. So on the next one, m times 1 over m equals 1. Again, that's the multiplicative inverse property. A value times its reciprocal equals 1. Multiplicative inverse was number 9. 2 plus c equals c plus 2. I've just switched the order around. That's my commutative property of addition. So number 1. The next one. 5 times 9 times a, 5 times 9 times a. Here my parentheses are around the first 2, here they're around the last 2. That's my associative property of multiplication, so number 7. And the last one, 0 times b equals 0. Anything times 0 equals 0 is my multiplicative property of 0, so number 10.